After a long day of walking and leading, he comes and he just says to himself, I am done. He sits down, he takes a big breath, he looks straight up at the sky, lays on his back and stares, and he feels so small in the midst of the bigness of the beautiful stars. This loneliness, this isolation, this loneliness is his happiest place on earth as he stares up at the sky and realizes, I'm all alone, just the way I like it. He sees the beauty of the stars, and he's lost in it. He can't hear the sound of the sheep going ba, ba, ba on every side. He doesn't smell their stinkiness anymore. He is just lost. And as he stares up the stars, he feels totally comfortable. And then his mind starts to wander. His mind starts to wander on all the things that have brought him there to that moment. How he met his wife, coincidentally. He starts to wonder, would she still love me if she knew? What would my friends think if they knew I was a fugitive on the run from the law? What would people think if they knew the real me? He starts to ask himself. And in the midst of this shame, what he wants to do is he wants to distract himself. He wants to think about something else so he doesn't have to deal with his own internal thoughts, his own internal feelings. He wants to push and stuff them down because he doesn't want to ask those questions about his story, about his insecurity, about his past, about where he's been. And in the middle of stuffing it, all of a sudden he's like, is that a fire? He looks over, he sits up, he's like, did I not turn the fire off? Is that bush on fire? It sure looks like the bush is on fire, but the bush isn't burning. And as he starts to stare, he starts to look at it, and all of a sudden it says to him, Moses, Moses. He's like, the bush knows my name. So something's wrong with the bush or something's wrong with me. I've been sniffing too many sheep fume and it's got me going crazy because the bush is talking to me. He stands up and he looks at the bush and the bush is not burning and the bush is talking to him. And the bush has a big plan for him. And he's like, whoa, 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 bush, calm down. I'm just a shepherd. I'm here because I want to be alone by myself. And what the bush is asking me to do makes me a little uncomfortable. Friends, this is where our story begins. This morning we are in the book of Exodus, the second book of the Bible, chapter 3. If you have your Bibles, go ahead and turn there. Ushers will come forward and give you a Bible if you need one. You see, we are in week 2 of a series entitled Exodus, a community in transition. Last week we talked about 2 things. Quick recap. Number 1, we said every single one of us are in transition. Family, job, some sort of transition. And the second thing we talked about is the Israelites have been slaved in Egypt for 430 years. And now God, through a burning bush, is talking to a fugitive, a murderer, an outcast, a runaway, who's hiding his old life because he doesn't want anyone to know until the bush starts talking to him. Again, we are in Exodus chapter 3. We'll start in verse 1. Here's the story. Now Moses was tending the flock of his father-in-law, Jethro, a priest in Midian. He led the flock to the far side of the wilderness and came to Horeb, the mountain of God. Stop, pause, real quick. The mountain of God. We are one book into the Bible. We're in the 3rd chapter of the 2nd book, and there's the reference to the mountain of God. As though everyone knows what the mountain of God is. But this is the very first reference. So the reader is going to ask themselves immediately, what is the mountain of God? We'll come back to that question. It's locked on. Verse 2. There, the angel of the Lord appeared to Moses in the flames from fire within the bush. Moses saw the bush was on fire, but it did not burn up. So Moses thought, I will go over and see this strange sight. Why does the bush not burn up? The Lord saw that Moses had gone over to take a look, and God called to him from the bush, Moses, Moses. I love that God says his name twice. I think like most of us, the first time God talks to us, we ignore it. And so God's like, I know I'm going to have to talk to him multiple times. So Moses finally says, here I am. Isn't that awesome? Like God doesn't know where you are. Hey, I'm right here, God. Thanks, Moses. That's so helpful. Verse 5, do not come any closer, God said. Take off your sandals, for this place where you are standing is holy ground. Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, the God of Jacob. At this, Moses fell to his face because he was afraid to look at God. There's this combination of this desire to get close to God, but know that God is so holy, he's so different, we don't deserve to stand in his presence. Verse 7, I am the Lord. No, wait, I misread that. Try that again. The Lord said, I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because they're slave drivers, the Egyptians. I am concerned about their suffering. I wonder if Moses is like, have you, first time in 430 years, you've been concerned about them? But he's in the presence of God. He doesn't smart off. So I have come to rescue them from the land of the Egyptians, to bring them into the land of good and spacious land flowing with milk and honey. Essentially, this is high quality real estate. The home of the Canaanites, the Hittites, the Amorites, the Perizzites, the Hivites, the Jebusites, the Megabites, the Gigabites. You wouldn't know the difference between a Canaanite and a Gigabite anyway, it doesn't matter. And now, the cry of the Israelites has reached me. Their prayers have finally gotten through, and I have seen the way the Egyptians are oppressing them. So now I say to you, go. I am sending you, Moses, to Pharaoh, the king of the Egyptians, to bring my people, the Israelites, out of slavery in Egypt. But Moses said to God, who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring out the Israelites from Egypt? Who am I that I should go? Friends, think about this. If you were standing there and there was a fire spontaneously combusted in front of you, think of all the questions you would ask. Did I leave the stove on? How does the bush know my name? Do I have any marshmallows? How does the bush know my name? Of all the questions he could ask, his number one question is, who am I? Friends, this is the question that I think most of us ask. And let's be clear. The question is not, what is my name? Where am I from? What's my social security number? What's my address? The question is not, who am I? The question that he asks is the question that we all ask ourselves in some form or another. And the question we all ask ourselves, that Moses asks himself, is this: am I good enough? We all ask ourselves some form of this question. Am I good enough? Am I a good enough dad? Am I good enough at my job? Am I a good enough spouse or roommate? A good enough student? Am I smart enough? Am I disciplined enough? Am I thin enough? Whatever it may be, we all have these questions that we're asking, and we do everything we can to avoid this question because we don't want to be alone with our thoughts and deal with the reality of what if the answer is no, I'm not good enough. So Moses, who's fleeing from his old life and insecurity, doesn't start with, God, are you powerful enough? God, are you really calling me? His first question is not about God and God's power and God's provision and God's promise. His first question is about himself. Friends, we all struggle with doubt, but let me be clear. Most of us, most often, struggle with doubt in ourselves and not doubt in God. Don't get me wrong. We all have doubts about God, but most of us have more doubts about ourselves. So what does God do What does Jesus say to this man who's struggling with self-doubt, asking the question that we all ask ourselves, am I good enough? What does he say to him? He says, go back to Egypt. Now, for some of you, you're like, okay, what's the big deal? The people of God are enslaved in Egypt. Of course, the Savior needs to go back to Egypt. But it's bigger than that. Moses has spent his entire life avoiding Egypt. Why? Many reasons. First of all, he's a murderer. He's a fugitive on the run from the law. When he was living in Egypt, he saw an Egyptian slave master oppressing and mistreating the Israelites, and he killed, murdered, buried the body. People started to talk, whisper, whisper, whisper. Hey, did you hear what Moses did? Did you hear what Moses did? So he ran away to be a fugitive. He started a whole new life for himself because he didn't want people to know he was a murderer. He also fled from Egypt because he never felt like he fit in Egypt. Moses is what we call a third culture kid, meaning he has two different cultural identities that come together and he doesn't fit with either one. By blood, he's an Israelite and he's even raised by his mom, kind of. But he's also raised in the house of Pharaoh, the king of Egypt. He's an Egyptian. He's like, who am I? He's a third culture kid. He doesn't know which one he falls into. He's a murderer. He doesn't fit in because he's a third culture kid. He's also an orphan. Wondering, hey, I've never met my dad. Why did my parents give me away instead of trying to keep me? The loneliness of feeling forgotten and ignored by your parents. The fourth thing he says, I'm just a shepherd. Look at me, I just take stinky sheep and help them wander around the wilderness. That's all I do. I'm not a savior, I'm not a rescuer, I'm not a conqueror. How could I ever do this? So how is it that Moses is doing everything in his power to avoid Egypt? Everything in his power to avoid his past, to avoid his insecurity. And the number one thing God says is you have to go and engage and go to the place that you don't want to go. You have to go to the place where you feel most insecure, most afraid, most not good enough. That's the place where God takes you. Is God mean? Is God cruel? Why would God do this to Moses? Here's the reason. Because if you don't own your story's going to own you. Let me say that again. If you don't own your story's going to own you. Let me explain what this means. This past weekend, my wife had the opportunity to go and spend 4 days away with her best friend from childhood. They grew up in Southern California, but they met on the central coast of Oregon, and they spent 4 days together, which means my wife had to take an entire brain full of how to keep the children alive and pass it on to her husband, who has no idea what happens hour to hour, minute to minute to keep the children alive. So what she did is she created the longest document. It was about the size of my senior thesis, and this is how you keep the children alive. This is how you keep them fed. This is what you do. This is what you don't do. And so she downloads all of this information, and then she thinks to herself, this is not enough. So what am I going to do? I'm going to invite Kyle's dad, his wife, and 2 cousins in. I'll bring in 4 additional reinforcements because what it takes one mom to do, it takes a dad and 4 others to do, all right? So she gets to go, and it's awesome. Amen. Yes. Yes. So what happens is my dad, his wife come in town, and they go, and we get to the final day, and they leave on Monday morning, which leaves me about 12 hours where I am alone trying to keep the children alive. And everything's going fine because I've got a great schedule. And she's taught me how to do it. And all of a sudden, it gets to that time where I get the littlest one, Noah, the 2-year-old, down for a nap. The oldest one, Josiah, comes home from school. They get 1 show. Then I bribe them with a snack to get them in the car. Because once I get them in the car, I take them to swim class. After swim class, they're going to be tired. I'm going to take them to In-N-Out for dinner. It's straight to bedtime. Victory, I'm a good dad. And so after that show, I do the bribery, I get the snacks there, I get to put them in the car so they can get to swim school. And then all of a sudden, Noah, the 2-year-old, says, no! I'm like, there's a long plan, Noah. Don't you know how this works? No, I want one more show. And so I go, I bribe him, I get him there, and finally I get him and I drag him, and I just throw him in his car seat. And all of a sudden, he does this like core exercise. He must have stronger back muscles than I do, because what he does is, instead of like sitting in his car seat, what he does is he goes, ooh, and I'm like, how did he do this? So I'm like trying to push him into his seat. I'm like, dang, you are ripped, bro. Like, he's so strong. I know, all by myself. I'm like, no. And so I'm like trying to push him into the car seat because I want him in there because I got to get to swim class, but I don't push him too hard because if I crush his rib cage, that's not a good dad. You can't leave any bruises, right? So I'm just like push him, and he's like, no. I'm like, how are you so strong? And I'm pushing. And eventually I just yell, I'm like, Noah! And I hear it. I literally heard my voice echoing between the houses on my street. There's this echo, and I'm like, what is wrong with me? I am yelling at a 2-year-old because I don't want to be 10 minutes late to swim class. What is wrong with me? And I realized, started thinking about it all this week, and I realized, that's what you do in the Thomsen family. When you're stressed out and one of the children don't do what you want, you yell at them because there's nothing else that makes you feel powerful. So when my parents felt stressed out and out of control, and they couldn't control their kids, they yelled at them. That's the family story. So what happens is now I yell at my kids. Why? Because if I don't own my story will own me, and I will be a slave to my story. The same way the Israelites were enslaved in Egypt, I will be enslaved to my past unless I own my story and say, it has to be done now. When I was 14 years old, I'll never forget it. I was sitting in my room, playing on my computer, and my parents said to me, we need to talk to you. That is not common language in the Thomsen home. We don't talk about anything. It's how it's done. So when they said I needed to talk to you, I was surprised but not surprised, and they walked me down, and my mom and dad said to me, we just want to let you know that we're getting divorced. I said, okay. And I walked back to my room, closed the door, and just continued playing on my computer. Why? Because growing up, Kyle Thompson's way, when feelings were stressful, overwhelming, or out of control, I would just go and totally check out and do whatever I wanted and be alone. So what happens when my little small family of 4 becomes me, my dad, his wife, the 2 cousins, and my 2 boys who are so excited? Dinner table this past Friday night was crazy excited. There was talking, there was excitement, there was games, all of these things going on. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I'm overwhelmed. So I looked around and I'm like, have people eaten enough dinner so I can just go and retreat to my room and be alone? And so what did I do? I did enough. I cleared the table, right? And then I just walked up to my room to be alone. Was there anything dysfunctional about my dinner table this Friday? No, it was just 4 kids, 2 grandparents. It was just normal, fun, crazy around the house, right? Nothing dysfunctional, but what happens? What is my story? When you feel overwhelmed, you just step back like, I don't want any part of this. And I realized, oh my gosh, if I don't own my story is going to own me. And there's these patterns that I have that were learned. Maybe they came naturally to us that somehow, and if we don't own these stories own us. So what's Moses' story? I run away from all the things that make me feel insecure about myself. So what does God do? He says, I'm going to take the thing that makes you feel most insecure, and I'm going to make you face it head on. Because what happens is when we sweep things under the rug, we trip over it later. And what God says is, what you have pushed down into the darkest parts of your heart, I'm going to bring out into the light so I can set you free from those things. Because if you don't own your story will own you. So Moses says, fine. That's not totally true. What actually happens is Moses and God have a 2-chapter debate. If you're in a small group, this week in your small group, you're going to see this debate continue. It goes through the end of Exodus chapter 3. You can read it on your own. And then in chapter 4, he continues to have this debate with God saying, I'm not good enough. And God says, well, I'm good enough. And they go back and forth, back and forth. You'll discuss that in your small groups this week. And then after 2 chapters of debate, what Moses finally does is he listens to God and he goes back to Egypt. But I want to show you something interesting on a map that happens. If you go, you'll see there's this map. The first screen, what you'll see, that's not how we planned. Okay, if you could see it, you can kind of see it right here. Any way we can get that on the side screens? Is that possible? No? All right, what you'll see here is on the far east side, you'll see Midian. This is where Moses met his wife and became a shepherd. Then it came over in the middle of it, you'll see is Mount Horeb, also known as the mountain of God. And then what you'll see is he travels all the way up to Egypt. Now, what you heard me say last week is the journey from Egypt to the promised land could be an 11-day journey. Look at this straight path. That's the 11-day journey. But Moses does not take the Egyptians that way. Look at the path in red that he takes them. Next slide. Now, some of you may be thinking to yourself, wait, that makes no sense. Oh, that's right, he didn't have an iPhone, no GPS. Or is there a different reason? Why is it that Moses didn't take them 11 days? Is he a bad leader? Does he not know where he's going? No. What does he do? He takes them back to Horeb, back to the mountain of God, that later becomes known as Mount Sinai. If you grew up in church or watched the Ten Commandments, you know Mount Sinai is where the Israelites encounter God and receive the Ten Commandments. Does Moses take the Israelites the most direct way from slavery to freedom? No. What does he do? He takes them the only route he knows how to go. Why? Because you can't lead someone somewhere you've never been. You cannot lead somewhere you've never experienced and where you're not willing to go. What happens to Moses? He has this absolutely transformational encounter with God on Horeb, on the mountain of God, later known as Sinai. And so what does he do? He goes to the Israelites and says, I experienced God on this mountain and I want to take you back because I want you to have the same experience with God that I did. Friends, you cannot lead where you've never been, and you cannot lead where you are not willing to go. Parents, let me say it this way. If you are tired of your kids yelling and screaming at you, stop trying to get them to stop yelling and stop yourself from yelling. Friends, you want to know who the best people are? So on Wednesday nights, we have this this group called Celebrate Recovery. It's for people for hurts, hang-ups, and habits that they just can't get themselves out of. A lot of these folks are struggling with addiction of one form or another. Do you know the best people to lead that ministry? Me? No. The best people to lead that ministry are recovering addicts because they say, I've been there, and I know what it's like to struggle, and I know what it's like to be free. The best people to lead are people who have been there and experienced it. Let me say it this way. You know who the worst people are at inviting others to church? The worst people at telling other people about Jesus? People who love church. Now, something like, that doesn't make any sense. Trust me. The best people at telling people about Jesus are people who love Jesus and only kind of like church. Because the people who love church, they go to church too much. They're in like 3 different small groups. They're volunteering every single day. They start saying weird words that no one understands, like fellowship and brotherly love and sanctification and all these words that no one understands, right? When you go to church too much, what happens is you get a little bit weird. People have like these life struggles, pain, and you like fortune cookie them to death with like, don't worry, God has a plan. And you're like, I'm in pain right now. Is this God's plan for me? People who go to church too much are the worst at inviting other people to church. The people who are the best at inviting people to church are the people who don't go to church too much because they know what real life, real people look like, act like, think like, because like, I've been there. The people who grew up in the church are usually the worst at inviting others to church. But the people who became a follower of Jesus later in life say, I know what slavery is like, and I know what the fear of going to church for the first time is like, and I want to walk other people through that because I know what it's like. I've been there. Friends, you cannot lead where you are not willing to go. But the scary thing is, God is going to call you to go to the places that make you feel the most insecure, the most inadequate, because those are the places where you have to trust God the most. And those are the places where you will confront the lies in your head and your heart that you just want to sweep under the rug. Some of you are like, is there any other way? Not according to this passage. So if we're going to take the steps to own our story so our story doesn't own us, what are we going to do? When God calls us to go back and confront the places of insecurity and shame and self-doubt, what are those steps? Maybe write these down. For some of you, the first step that you need to do is you just need to write a letter. Write a letter to yourself, write a letter to God, write a letter to that person who you never want to talk to ever again. You don't need to send that letter. You don't have to stamp it. You don't have to mail it, but you just have to write it down to own that it happened. For some of you, maybe there's a second step of saying, what do I need to do? I need to have a conversation with God about it. You want to know what the craziest thing is? When I talk to people who are in significant tragedy in their lives, who are struggling with different things, I say to them, hey, how are you talking to God about this? And they say to me, I can't talk to God about this. Well, why not? Because I'm too ashamed to admit to myself that this is my struggle with sin. Because I don't want to admit that that thing happened to me. Because I'm so insecure that if I think about it, talk about it, I can't do that. So you write a letter. You talk about it with God. Maybe you need to have a conversation with a friend that says, hey, this is a sin I'm struggling with. This is what I'm enslaved to. This is my past that I'm running away from. Can we talk? Some of you need to share these things with your small group, a support group. That's why we have small groups that are meeting throughout the week to discuss these topics. That's why we have Celebrate Recovery here on Wednesday nights. But for some of you, whoa, I'm not ready to talk about it with a group. You need to find a Stevens minister or a counselor, someone who's been trained to help you walk through this. Because the good news is, when God calls you to walk through these things, he never calls you to walk through it alone. In your small group this week, you're going to see that God brings this guy named Aaron to partner with Moses so Moses doesn't have to go alone. God says to him, you know what the promise is? You want to know what the plan is? I know you're scared to go back to Egypt, but God says to Moses, I will go with you so you don't have to go alone. Isn't this what Jesus did for us? When Jesus became a human 2,000 years ago, he said, you don't have to live through life struggles alone. I will become a human. I will step into your pain, into your shame, and into your struggle so that you never have to journey through life alone. 1 Peter says this. It says that Jesus didn't want us to be alone, so what did he do? He went and he died on the cross, and for 3 days, he went down into the depths of hell and the grave to rescue the keys of death, hell, and the grave, and take them back from the devil. Why? So he could walk us into freedom, because we couldn't walk the journey on our own. Because that's why God sends Moses. God could have gone to the Israelites and said, Israelites, just go by yourselves. They would never have gone. So just like God the Father sent Jesus into the depths of hell, God sends Moses into the teeth of slavery in Egypt to combat the enemy who's oppressing and enslaving his people. Why? So the people of God can walk in freedom. Friends, God is inviting you to freedom, but the only way you can walk in freedom is if you have the courage to trust God to confront the things in your life that you want to avoid. If you don't own your story will own you. But the good news this morning is that God is rewriting a story, and he's put people and his presence around you so that you don't have to walk alone. Let's pray. Lord God, we thank you that when we are far away from us, you reach out. We thank you that you call us to do things that make us feel insecure and scared. So Lord, I pray that you would give us the comfort, that you'd give us the courage to confront all those barriers that stand in our way of following you, of confronting our past and living into freedom.